text. Maybe our friend from Alaska we can hear our Alaskan voice. Sarah Lynn, you want to read the first text in English?
Sure, thank you. When the personal tears. When the water was gone from the skin, she, Hagar, left the child under one of the bushes and went and sat down at a distance, a bowshot away. For she thought, let me not look on as the child dies. And sitting thus afar, she raised her voice and wept.
So she is weeping because she thinks she's going to watch her son die in the wilderness. And I imagine sort of these tears spilling onto the dry earth of the desert. So soon after we read this is the Torah portion from what we just read was from the Torah portion from day 1 of Rosh Hashanah. And then we read Haftorah from the book of the prophets for right after the Torah portion. And in that Torah portion, we read about Hannah, who also weeps to God about a child. She's unable to conceive, and she goes to the temple, and the text says this when she gets to the temple. Marilyn, I see on my screen. Would you read about Hannah for us?
Tears of empathy?
Nope, just the second one under personal tears.
Sorry.
It's okay.
She, Hannah, was bitter in spirit, and she prayed to God, weeping all the while.
And so what I love about this moment in Hannah is that she's praying to conceive a child. We have a lot of barren women in the Torah and a lot of barren women on Rosh Hashanah. And she's crying and praying at the same time. And the priest, Eli, is watching her. And even though he's watching her, she's still sort of having these tears flow, and she's pouring her heart out to God. And part of me wishes we lived in a world where people felt comfortable doing this while they prayed. Maybe some people do, but it's not that common. So these personal tears are like most of the tears I suspect that we cry most of the time. And those are tears that emerge out of our personal life, right? Somebody dies, someone hurts us, we're sad about loss. So these tears of Hagar and Hannah are tears that come from their own situations. And that's often true. Our hearts are most connected to our experiences and the experience of those whom we're in relationship. So even though most of our tears may come from that place, not all tears fall for personal reasons. And not all the biblical stories at Rosh Hashanah come from those places. So on second day Rosh Hashanah, I'm going to start first, we read Torah and then Haftorah, but I'm going to start with Haftorah. So second day Rosh Hashanah, Haftorah, we read about Rachel, the matriarch of our people, who weeps inconsolably for the nation of Israel, who's been exiled from its homeland. So, and if someone will read text, Roseanne, I see on my screen, I'm just picking who I see. Will you read the first one? This is Rachel's weeping on second day Rosh Hashanah. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Tears of empathy. A voice is sounded in Ramah, a wailing, bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children. She has refused to be consoled about her children, for they are no longer.
Okay, so Rachel, thank you. Rachel's not wailing for her actual children, but for the displaced nation, so the nation of Israel. So unlike Hagar and Hannah, Rachel's tears are tears that not arise from her, just her own personal situation, but are tears of empathy, tears for circumstances that aren't directly about her. So, and then perhaps the most striking piece is the next set of tears. So second day Rosh Hashanah Torah reading is the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And just to summarize real quickly, Abraham is called by God to bring his son up to the mountain and place him on the altar and sacrifice him as a sacrifice to God. And that's an incredibly disturbing thought, because we see Abraham take a knife and raise it above his son. But perhaps the most disturbing part is the lack of emotion that we see in the text of the Akedah. There's no tears in the Torah text, either from Abraham or Isaac. Isaac doesn't protest, and Abraham doesn't show us any emotion. And we see very little hesitation also from this. So it says in Genesis 22, and Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. And we don't see any emotion, and that's very chilling. So the absence of emotion in the Akedah text has puzzled commentators for nearly 2,000 years. And the classical rabbis wrote what's Midrash, which is a narrative commentary on the Torah. And when they write Midrashim, they're looking for what's missing in the text often, or maybe something that a word that isn't usually used in that way. But often it's something, they're looking for holes in the text, places where the terse writing of the Torah, where questions are left unanswered. And they believed that there were answers to these questions, and it just wasn't in the written text. And then it was their job to uncover the sacred messages that were not explicated in Torah. Or a traditional idea is that that was the oral, that the Midrashim were given by God as oral Torah. But the point is that Midrashim are looking at the unanswered questions or ambiguities. And I think, for me, they often teach us about Torah, but they also teach us about the concerns of the rabbis who wrote them. And it is very clear that they noticed Abraham's lack of emotion in the story of the binding of Isaac. There are several Midrashim where the rabbis expand the story to include Abraham's tears. And here's just one of them. So will someone actually read, yeah, let's see, who do I see? See Joni. Karen, will you read to us Abraham's, the Yalkut, the Midrash in the
Yalkut 21, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The ministering angels.
No, well, above that first.
Okay.
Abraham's
eyes were directed at Isaac's, and Isaac's at the heaven of heavens. Tears were flowing from Abraham's eyes until his entire body was all but afloat in them.
So the rabbis are adding, what do they find missing in the story of the Akedah are the tears from Abraham. And actually there's another midrash that say the tears from Abraham's eyes actually made Isaac blind later in his life. Karen, keep going about the angels.
The ministering angels stood in rows upon rows, crying and weeping, as they said to one another, "Behold, one who is unique is about to slaughter, and one also unique is about to be slaughtered."
So here we see that the rabbis are adding both the angels' tears and the personal tears. So they're adding the personal tears to Abraham and then the empathetic tears of the angels. So they're kind of revealing the importance of both kind of tears. And so I think our work on Rosh Hashanah is to, as we weave together these biblical readings, is to really open our hearts and to use the feelings that emerge in these holidays to do the work of tshuva. So we live in a society that doesn't like tears, in my opinion. It doesn't really like emotions, right? We live rationality and we're productive. We get things done when we think through it, and we don't show too much emotion. And words really do fix things. That's sort of our cultural norm. But even though we need that, I think what our rabbis and our texts are teaching is that we need more than just that. We need to have open hearts as well. So I want to move on to the next set. Sorry, I have lost my pieces of paper. So the tears of change. So what I would argue is that we're learning here that tears is what causes change. And so if someone could read, can you go down a little bit, Paul? Or will we lose this? Or go to the next page, yeah. Cool. So I'll just read the beginning of that. So it says, and God, the angel said, "Do not raise your hand against this boy. Where was the knife? The tears had fallen from the angels upon it and dissolved it. So that's a very powerful image. And what I would say is that it's often hard to let the tears flow, and that sometimes when what this text is teaching us is that we can create change in the world by opening our hearts and by having emotions. So I think when we move on Rosh Hashanah from these tears that are personal, that are Hagar and Hannah's personal tears, to the tears of Rachel and the angels that are more tears of empathy and tears of looking out at other people, it's teaching us that we need to first work on ourselves. If the work of tshuva is about making change, then first we have to know our own hearts, like Hannah and Rachel, and open those hearts. And then when we have those open hearts, we hope that that moves us, the texts are teaching us, to a place of empathy where we can cry for others and make change, not just for ourselves and our own families, but for the larger world around us. And that's what we see in this text of change, because the tears of the angels actually made it impossible for the killing to happen, right? And that's also true in the text of Rachel on the second day, Rosh Hashanah, Haftorah. Her tears caused God to promise that the people will be returned to the land. So, right, she's crying about their exile, and she didn't simply cry unknowingly. The text states that she's refusing to be consoled. So I would say that this next text is a text that teaches us that tears can be one of political protest, right? So Jay, will you read to us, she refuses to be comforted?
She refuses to be comforted for her children who are gone. Thus said the Lord, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is a reward for your labor, declares the Lord. They shall return from the enemy's land.
Right, so basically you can imagine, here's this woman who will not be consoled, and God says after that, like, she refuses to be comforted, so God's like, okay, I'll return them. So also, just like the angel's tears dissolve the knife, Rachel's tears sort of convince God to make that change. And we don't live in that world. We don't live in that world where we, I mean, maybe we do, but I don't think that that kind of emotion is seen as a powerful method of change, and that opening our hearts is the way we're sort of taught or is highlighted. And so these texts really show us that that emotion was valued, that expressing that emotion is valued, both personal emotion, empathy, and that it can create a change in the world. And if this holiday and this holiday season is all about creating change for ourselves and to make the world a better place, then this is one way we do that. And I love, this is the final text, which I love because it kind of speaks to that. So Jane, will you read that final text?
Just excuse me, Rabbi, what that last
Yeah.
is how she changes God.
Right.
Oh, that
So
isn't,
she changes God. Right. That's not what?
it's not that she's changing herself or other people, but it's
Right.
convincing God he's made a mistake.
Right. That's true. I think of it as like her tears. She uses tears to change the outcome of a political situation. Does it not seem like that to you? Maybe I'm wrong.
I don't know about a political situation.
Right. So you're saying it's actually just about convincing God that God was wrong.
God has changed his mind.
Yeah. So her tears maybe are even more powerful than I think. If your tears can change God's mind, that's pretty big. Don't you think?
Or God is a very sensitive entity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another, yeah. Lorna, do you want to read that last text?
Okay. Tears of righteousness. The Sadiq, the righteous person, is one who owns his heart. And a person who owns his heart is one who can access his tears. This is
Right.
what it's at
Yeah, don't worry about that. It's a later
Mhm.
it's not from the Midrashim. It's much later writing, but again, this speaks to the idea that knowing one's heart makes us a tzaddik, which is the biggest compliment, right? Which is the sort of highest. Makes us a righteous person. So I would say that the work of tshuva we're learning here is the work of staying open-hearted and cultivating empathy. And that is what keeps us human. And I think in this time when we're so separated and see each other through screens, that those tears and that empathy can be challenging. And that part of the work of this holidays is really to remember the staying open and the cultivating empathy, and that to know that, you know, our tradition teaches that our tears can dissolve knives, so that so the heart is part of the work. So I have some questions, but I wanted first to just ask for reactions, thoughts. You can disagree with me. You can, you know, tell me what you think.
Well, I think Jews, along with like Italians or something, are much more likely to express our emotions and to not be embarrassed to cry.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's because of these kinds of sayings.
Maybe. Yeah. Roseanne wanted to say something.
I was really struck that when you opened this up and said that this is typically a time when we're with people who we're not with, you know, the rest of the year, sometimes family, then I started to cry.
Yeah.
And so what that, and as you've been sharing this, and we've been reading together, what I've been struck by is how important it is to, and maybe one of the foci of the High Holy Days is making the space for to know our hearts and to feel what we're feeling when we're typically just doing and not being.
That's right.
Not being with our feelings.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll say that it wasn't until I really cried about this Rosh Hashanah before I could start making a menu or start deciding what I was going to do. I just kept putting it off, and finally I, you know, cried about what's not happening this year, and then I started getting good ideas. So anybody, any other thoughts?
This is Roz. Sometimes there's something that relieves you when you cry versus bottling things up. And I think about when I was younger, my parents, especially my mom and her sisters, when something traumatic happened, a death or whatever, there was crying, and I'll use the term wailing for lack of a better term, but really outward expression of sadness. And I can't say that I honestly see that anymore.
Mm-mm.
You know, maybe people do that privately at home or whatever, but you know, I think there's something to say about crying and tears and helping you get over or get to the next step in whatever, you know, phase or process you happen to be in. You know, it's like, okay, I cried. I don't necessarily feel happier, but I feel some relief. and then I can go on with what's next. That's just kind of my view.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to just say before I call on Marilyn, I want to say too, it's not just about tears. Like tears is one way to express big emotions, right? So like some people don't let tears fall, but like maybe it means there's other ways to express emotion. But I think it's about the not bottling up and or knowing it. And what Roseanne said is opening the heart. I know for some people tears don't come easily, and that, you know, but it's like, how can you access your emotions and how can you allow them to move through you, even if it's not with tears? I'm pretty good at crying. So, so Marilyn.
Well, basically, I was going to say something similar to what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we tend to project certain behaviors, indicate certain things. So if you're crying, you're happy or you're sad, and maybe that's how I would react. But as you said, not everybody demonstrates that outward emotion. Some people do other things. Doesn't mean they're not sad or that they're not happy.
Right.
You just can't always assess how they're feeling.
Right.
Do you think that's a societal thing about not expressing yourselves? Or do you think that's just the way people are?
I think it's a little bit of both without thinking it through. I think we all have our own personal way of responding.
Yeah.
And which might change over time too, depending on what it is.
Yeah, good.
Or where we are actually in our lives. Maybe we're more willing to let our guard down more with other people around. But I think too, probably, Roz, there are other societal expectations, but I'm not sure which one is more at play. I think perhaps the more the individual, but I think it's just a guess on my part.
You can flip this from making these things your personal reaction to seeing someone else's reaction and how that makes you feel, or how important that is for you to understand what happened or how that person is feeling.
Right. So tears can also help you understand somebody. Yeah. I see Mercy and Becca just unmuted. Did Mercy?
Marcy, you can go ahead.
Maybe she's not there.
I was thinking about the cultural aspect of how different cultures look at crying. I've lived overseas for a while, and just, it's interesting. And it's interesting how things change over time too, because, one thing that I noticed, like in Senegal, when a child starts crying, they try to shut them up as soon as possible, like whatever it'll take to stop them from crying. And here, being a parent of a young child, and I think this is a relatively new thing of, not shutting down that emotion, even in a child, but letting, talking about what is it that's upsetting you and getting it out there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting shutting it up versus getting it out there is an interesting thing.
Yeah, Sarah Lynn.
Well, I was taken with the a couple things that one is that all of these passages are parents crying with in response to their children, or something that's gone with them. And then I also think about, just in the Torah, that it's the women who are crying.
Yeah.
And just thinking about kind of the the burden for men to not be able to express their tears, being told that, as little boys, don't cry, or you're a sissy, or whatever. And often learning to shut that part of themselves off.
It is noteworthy that if you take all 4 of those portions, the place where we're missing the tears is the men. And the rabbis then tell us that, I think by adding the Midrashim, adding the tears in is saying what you're saying. I also question whether like Rachel crying inconsolably, and that's how she created change or changed God's mind, was through tears. Is emotions like the only tool she had, right? She didn't have power in another way. Like, and does that happen too with gender, of like both men are shut down, and also it's something that women have had when they don't have other power, I guess. But it is interesting.
I want to stick up for Abraham and his lack of tears, because
Okay.
he's in a spot where it's so horrific that he's in shock. And I think physiologically you don't cry in that moment. And so it's the angels who have to do it for him. And I totally get it. All those rabbis for all those thousands of years, I think I see where Abraham is coming from.
That he couldn't cry that much. Do you think he cried afterwards?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
But they don't tell you about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Renee? Those are cries of relief.
Who's crying of relief?
Abraham.
Oh, relief that he didn't have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Joni was going to say something.
I agree with the point of view about Abraham not being able to cry in that moment. I've thought about that a lot, but I wonder if that is something that we should be talking about more during Rosh Hashanah and at other times of the year, because maybe we have this image of him as someone who couldn't open his heart. And then to bring it forward to 2020, what kinds of things can we do to help people learn how to open their hearts to themselves and to each other, especially if we're thinking that an open heart leads to empathy, leads to positive change.
Yeah.
What do we learn from all of that we can use today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think my question maybe, well, I don't have the answer for that. I think it's different, but I wonder if we think about what stops us from feeling empathy. Either what stops us first, or also were there moments where expressing emotion, tears or otherwise, created positive change for you in the past year? Were there moments where doing that you saw the knives dissolve, or or God change,
Are you asking me that, or are you asking
everybody? But Joni, you go right ahead. You love.
No, I just think that I would like to add one more thing to that, is that sometimes people have empathy for others, but they don't know it, or they don't know how to express that. They might have an open heart and they might have feeling for others, but sometimes they stop themselves short a little bit, And we see, people making jokes that aren't so appropriate, or making, turning the other cheek. But, how do we also learn how to help people express empathy at just sometimes, get practice at it.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say right now.
Well, I think people grieve and react to things in different ways. And I'm not sure that you can make a judgment call as to tears or not tears or anything else just by looking at someone, maybe even someone you think you know well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it's hard to know when people are, we shouldn't assume just because they don't show it. Right. Like what Dory said, that that the tears were there. They just, it was a too traumatic moment to shed them.
I mean, even in terms.
Lorna, I'm going to let somebody else go and then I'll come back to you. Sorry. Roseanne?
So I was thinking about what you asked about how do we learn empathy. And I was struck that Isaac didn't look at his dad, that he was looking up at the heavens. And it made me think about how we learn empathy by being empathized with. And if he looked over at his dad, he wouldn't have seen him looking empathic.
Yeah.
And so I just was thinking as a psychologist that's, you know, I think we need to know how we feel, to know our own internal feeling states. They have to be recognized and
right.
validated and named, you know, by our parents or other significant people.
And we actually, after the Akedah, we never see Isaac and Abraham together alive. They don't go down the mountain together. They never speak again. We see Isaac at Abraham's burial, but this is yeah. And you know, I've been thinking, Dory, it's a very generous reading of Abraham, but he also chose to do it. So it's traumatic, but I wonder where the choice in there is. It feels different than different actually than Hagar sitting there watching her son almost die.
Yeah, because he has to do it. It's horrible. But maybe he, I mean, it doesn't, I don't know the Bible that well, but did he just get the instructions from God and say, all right, whatever you say, I'm on it? Or, I mean, did he think, how can you ask this of me? And did he struggle with it? And there he is in the midst of this struggle.
Right. Yeah, Karen.
Actually, it's making me think of how I've thought about Abraham over time. And so I think that Dorian's comment is interesting, because sort of the classic teaching about Abraham at the Akedah is that he's following blind faith. But then later on in the Torah, he challenges and he argues with Hashem. And so I think for me anyway, what that shows is how we can grow as individuals, because Abraham clearly grew and became a better person through time. If we look at time through the Torah.
Yeah.
If we think of it as linear time, I'm not saying that we should necessarily, but in this case, it's a kind of a teaching.
Nice. Thank you. I want to say one more set of tears. Lorna, did you want to finish? I
think, first of all, Abraham circumcised himself. And frankly, that probably took a lot of trust and to do that. But the one about Hannah is that she's crying and the elder that sees her thinks she's drunk.
That's right.
So, which is, can't tell what makes people feel whatever.
Right. I always think of that as the priest thought she was drunk. She must have been so kind of full of out of control almost, right?
Crying.
Yeah, right. But I mean that amount of out of control, it wasn't just sort of some crying, right? But I was also wanted to just bring up one other set of tears, and that is there's a midrash that I didn't include that that the shofar blasts are actually Sarah's weeping.
Mhm.
That we see in this right after the Akedah in Torah, the sort of next portion of the Torah, Sarah dies.
Mhm.
And it doesn't connect the two stories except for in proximity in the Torah, but the rabbis connect that with, there's all sorts of things about, did Sarah learn about what happened? Did she think that her son actually was killed? She's not anywhere in chapter 22 of that, of where the Akedah is. And so the shofar blasts are understood as her, it's not the only understanding of the shofar blast, but of her wailing after hearing about the Akedah. And so they also add those tears of Sarah, because we don't hear anything from Sarah, and you kind of wonder, like, this isn't just a son. This is the son that they had when they were 90 and 100. This was like this is all they wanted, was this son, So, yeah.
I just wanted to add, Rabbi, that for those of us who have sounded the shofar, I had not ever heard this teaching about the sounding of the shofar as being Sarah's tears, but the shevarim, when you learn to sound the shofar, one of the things that you learn is that shevarim is supposed to sound like wailing and crying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's right, it's embedded, what you're relaying to us is embedded in the actual sounding.
Yeah. And I don't actually know, I think the sounding came first, but the rabbis talk, right? It's a midrash. I don't have it in front of me, but.
Rabbi, this is Roz. Quick question. How did Sarah hear about the Akedah?
That's the big question, because we don't see her again. We only hear that she died.
Okay.
So there's midrashim about her hearing about it. So that's what the rabbis add in, right?
Okay.
But we wonder where
Yeah.
was she? Where was she when they woke up early in the morning and took Isaac off? Was she in her tent? Did she know about it? Did she not know about it? Did she ever hear about it? Right. We don't know. Sarah's really absent from the whole from the text itself.
Okay.
I
thought maybe I missed something somewhere.
No, you didn't miss anything. No.
So there are a lot of opportunities for us to continue writing midrash.
Yeah. But I was going to say something about Karen and the shofar too, that also there's the broken notes of the shofar, the wailing, and then there's we finish with the whole note.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a similar thing, whether the crying sort of leads to wholeness. And that's the, right? Isn't that like the?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's like a legitimization of it encompasses everything that you're teaching today in terms of tears being so necessary and so valuable for us to really come to terms with who we are and what our emotions are. Yeah, and how necessary that is, because the Tekiah Gadolah then gives us that wholeness, and it's at the very end. Mm-hmm.
Right. Oh, I wish I had my.
Good point.
Oh, I do have a shofar, and also that that the shofar. I love the teaching that the shofar is narrow at the bottom, and then
and opens up.
Like right, we go from narrowness to openness. Yep. But
absolutely, yeah, beautiful.
So
many new things to think about this Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, I hope so. So I wanted to see if there's any more last thoughts in our last couple minutes. I want to also say that who got on the phone, who's not showing his screen, but my dad joined us from California, from the newly opened windows of fresh air in California. Hopefully still.
Wow.
Wonderful.
There's my dad. I'm probably embarrassing him, and he's not on screen, but that's the Bauer on the screen. There
he is.
All right.
I couldn't let that pass. Since when can my dad come to when I teach in Madison? There's some good things about Zoom, right?
Renee, wait a minute. Have you told your dad about what a wonderful rabbi you are?
You can tell him that.
I've known that for a long time.
Of course you have.
Thanks,
Okay.
Welcome, Mr. Bauer.
So I just want to give each of you permission this Rosh Hashanah this is a Rosh Hashanah like none of us have ever had. This one that we'll never forget, and hopefully it'll be the last one of its kind. But it's going to bring up a lot. Like maybe there'll be things we like better. Maybe some people are going to like going to synagogue in their pajamas on their couch. I'm going to do some stuff outside. That's what I need to do. And maybe, so maybe there'll be some nice things in that, but to let whatever comes up, come up, and, whether they're tears, but, I hope that whatever comes up is real, and it's not going to be easy for most of us to celebrate in this way. But my prayer is that everyone finds some sweetness both over the holiday, and certainly that we find more sweetness in the new year. And that next year we're in a room studying Torah and blowing shofar together. So,
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shana Tova.
Thank you.
Shana Tova to everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shana Tova.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Paul.
Take care.
Tony, everybody.
Yep.